Hello and thank you for downloading. My name's Steve Johnson, and this is the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. This episode will continue the theme of using artificial intelligence to analyze particular key aspects of information. But this will be the first episode that looks at a specific incident in detail. The particular incident in this case is the Hixon Level Crossing accident, and I'd like to start by acknowledging, as we will in future inquiry-related episodes, the people that have lost their lives in order that these lessons have been brought to us. Specifically for Hixon Level Crossing, there were 11 people that lost their lives and many more who suffered serious injuries as a result of the collision between a train and a road transporter. You will, in the rest of this podcast, then hear two voices. And though this may sound very realistic, these are two computer voices conducting an entirely artificial intelligence-based large language model analysis of the report of a public inquiry into the accident at Hixon Level Crossing on January the 6th, 1968. They are not real people, and their analysis is entirely based on a computer analysis. I'm really interested in your thoughts and comments about how you found their discussion of the incident. Do please get in contact or leave comments after this podcast in order to give me your thoughts, views. Would you like to hear more of it? Or is there a particular incident or inquiry that you'd like them to look at in the future? Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the podcast.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into a tragic accident from 1968 at the Hixon Level Crossing in Britain.
It was a really a pivotal moment in railway safety history, and the inquiry that followed really unearthed some, I think, crucial insights into not just how accidents happen, but why they happen.
Right, and we're not just looking at the what happened. We're interested in the why. And to do that, we're going to be carefully examining this formal inquiry report, focusing on the causes, all the contributing factors that led to this accident, but also the recommendations, the steps that were proposed to prevent something like this from ever happening again.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that even though this report is, from over 50 years ago, the lessons about human error, risk assessment, especially when it comes to new technology, they're just as relevant today as they were back then. Human nature hasn't changed much.
That's so true. And speaking of things that haven't changed, that statistic mentioned early on about accident rates in Holland really caught my attention.
Oh, right. Yeah, the one about automatic crossings actually having higher accident rates than manned crossings.
Yeah. It really makes you question assumptions about automation and safety, doesn't it?
It definitely does. We tend to think that, more technology equals more safety, but sometimes it's not that straightforward. There are always trade-offs, and you have to consider the human element.
Exactly. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's set the scene at Hixon, paint a picture for our listeners.
All right, so imagine this. A rural level crossing, pretty standard stuff. And you have this massive transporter, like truly enormous, carrying a heavy transformer, slowly lumbering across the tracks.
I was reading that this transporter was so big it needed 2 tractors, one in front and one behind, to move it, and required special permits just to be on the road. So we're not talking about your average truck here.
No, not at all. This thing was moving at a snail's pace and would have taken a significant amount of time to clear the crossing. Which brings us to the automatic half-barrier system, the new kid on the block at the time.
Right, because this wasn't like the old manned gates that we often see in, old movies and stuff. This is a relatively new technology, right?
Yeah, this was a big shift from those traditional manned gates. This new automatic system was triggered by an approaching train. So first you'd have flashing lights, then you'd hear warning bells, and then finally the barriers would descend, all designed to, give drivers enough time to clear the crossing.
So we have this huge transporter slowly making its way across, and an express train comes barreling down the track. What happened next?
It was a tragic scene. The train, unable to stop in time, struck the rear of the transporter. The impact was devastating, multiple deaths, several injuries, and it sent shockwaves through the nation, prompting this formal inquiry to figure out just what went wrong.
And what they found was not just a single mistake, a single point of failure, but a whole chain of errors. A confluence of factors all contributing to this horrific accident.
Let's start with the transporter driver himself. What went wrong on his end? Well, it seems like he made a few critical misjudgments. First off, he seems to have placed too much trust in his police escort, assuming that, they'd made sure the crossing was safe. And he also seemed to believe that there was some kind of safety mechanism in place, like a fail-safe that would automatically stop the train if a vehicle was on the crossing.
So a combination of assumptions and maybe not fully understanding how this new system worked.
It seems that way. And to make matters worse, he didn't use the emergency telephone provided at the crossing.
Oh, right. There was an emergency telephone there.
Yes, it was a key safety feature for exactly this type of situation, but he didn't use it.
Which leads us to the haulage company, the driver's employers. They had a near-miss incident at another automatic crossing just a few months before Hixon. Seems like a huge red flag that maybe wasn't heeded.
You're absolutely right. This prior incident at the Leominster Level Crossing showed just how dangerous it could be for slow-moving vehicles on these new automatic crossings. But despite knowing the risk, it doesn't seem like they did enough to warn their drivers about the system's limitations or stress the importance of that emergency telephone.
So a case of not learning from past mistakes.
Unfortunately, it seems that way. And, it's not just the driver and the company. Even the police escort, while there to assist the transporter, had their share of oversights.
So they weren't really focused on the railway crossing itself.
Not specifically, no. It seems like they weren't fully trained on how the automatic system worked. They didn't seem to grasp the urgency of the situation or realize how quickly that train would be approaching. And they also failed to notice the emergency instructions posted at the crossing, which, could have made a difference.
Starting to sound like a whole system breakdown here.
Yeah.
Multiple points of failure.
Sadly, yes. And British Railways, who were responsible for the crossings, they also played a part in this. They knew that large loads frequently used the road to a depot near Hixon, but they didn't seem to fully anticipate the risk this posed to the new automatic system.
They just assumed that the emergency notice and telephone would be enough.
It appears so. There wasn't a robust public awareness campaign about the new system, and they didn't really follow up to see how effective those safety measures actually were in practice.
And then we have the Ministry of Transport, the ones who approved these crossings in the first place. Where did they fit into all of this?
Well, their calculations were primarily focused on what they called the zigzagging driver.
The zigzagging driver.
Yeah, someone who's trying to beat the barriers, being reckless, impatient, trying to squeeze through. But they completely overlooked the hazard posed by slow-moving vehicles like this transporter.
So they were so focused on one type of risky behavior that they missed another one entirely.
It seems that way. And their public awareness campaign wasn't as strong as it could have been either. They seemed to prioritize other road safety issues above automatic crossings, even though they knew the public was largely unfamiliar with these new systems.
So we have this combination of human error, technical limitations, and systemic oversights, all culminating in this horrific accident.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that even with good intentions, things can go wrong, and that new technology, especially when it comes to safety, needs to be carefully implemented with really thorough risk assessment and clear, unambiguous communication.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, the inquiry didn't just identify the problems, they also made a number of recommendations to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. Let's dive into those next.
All right, so let's unpack some of these recommendations. One of the most crucial ones focused on the warning time that drivers had. At the time, the system only gave drivers a maximum of 24 seconds from those first flashing lights to when the fastest train would actually reach the crossing.
Which we saw was just not enough time for that massive transporter to get out of the way.
Exactly. So the inquiry, they proposed extending that time cycle to 32 seconds. Give drivers more time to react, especially those in slow-moving vehicles, a better chance to clear the crossing safely.
Seems like a pretty straightforward solution.
Yeah.
But did they consider any downsides? Could giving drivers more time actually encourage those risk takers, the zigzagging drivers we talked about who might try to beat the barriers?
That's a great point. And yeah, the report does acknowledge that risk. They really emphasize the need to strike a balance between improving safety and maintaining what they call brisk operation of the railway. You don't want drivers getting complacent or thinking they have, this extra time to gamble with the barriers.
Right. It's that constant tension between trying to design a safe system and accounting for how people might actually behave, sometimes unpredictably.
Absolutely. Human behavior is always the wild card. And another key recommendation, this one addressed what they called the second train sequence. So picture this. A train passes through the crossing, the barriers start to rise, but then what if a second train's coming right behind it?
Ooh, yeah, I remember reading about that. Seemed like a recipe for disaster, especially if the second train arrived before the barriers were fully up. Talk about mixed signals.
Exactly. A very confusing and potentially deadly situation. So they recommended modifying the system so that those barriers would stay down if another train was approaching within a certain time frame. No more of that up and down will they, won't they situation for drivers, just clear, consistent signals.
Makes a lot of sense. Clarity and consistency, that's key in any safety system. You want drivers to be able to make quick, informed decisions without second-guessing what the system's doing.
Exactly. And, while we're on the topic of communication, the inquiry also highlighted the need for, well, clearer and more effective signage at the crossings.
Because that emergency notice we talked about earlier, the one that wasn't very clear or prominent, that clearly wasn't doing its job.
You got it. They recommended replacing it with signage that was much more, in your face, big, bold, impossible to miss instructions, especially when it came to that emergency telephone.
No more ambiguity, no more confusion. You arrive at the crossing, and boom, the instructions are right there, clear as day.
Exactly. And they went even further. They emphasized the need for public education, not just for drivers, but for everyone, about how these automatic crossings actually worked. No more assuming that people would figure it out on their own.
Right, because when you introduce a new technology, especially something as safety critical as this, you can't just assume people will instantly adapt. You have to, bridge that knowledge gap through education and clear communication.
Precisely. And they recommended some really specific things like public awareness campaigns, maybe even including information about automatic crossings in the highway code, like the UK's version of the rules of the road. Make that information readily available to everyone.
It seems like they were really trying to cover all the bases here.
Yeah.
From technical improvements to driver education to public awareness. Did they specifically address the issue of slow-moving vehicles, like the transporter in the Hixon accident?
They did. They recognized that those slow-moving vehicles were particularly vulnerable at these crossings, and they recommended, well, a few things. First, they said that drivers of these vehicles should be required to use that emergency telephone before crossing. No more guesswork, no more assumptions, just a clear procedure to ensure safety.
Seems like a very sensible precaution.
It was aimed at closing a dangerous gap in the system. They also discussed the possibility of, additional warning signals, but this time specifically for slow-moving vehicles, giving them even more advance notice that a train was coming.
So really a multifaceted approach, better technology, clear communication, and stricter procedures for those who needed extra precautions.
Exactly. They recognize that safety isn't just about one thing, it's about a whole system, a holistic approach, addressing both the technical aspects, the hardware and software, but also the human behaviors involved, how people interact with the system, how they perceive risk, how they make decisions under pressure, all of that.
It makes you wonder, if these recommendations had been in place before Hixon, could the accident have been prevented?
It's impossible to say for sure, but what we can say is that the inquiry was incredibly thorough. They really dug deep to understand what went wrong, they identified those critical weaknesses in the system, and they put forward some very practical and sensible solutions to make things safer. The Hixon accident, as tragic as it was, led to some incredibly valuable lessons.
Lessons that are still relevant today, right?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. The world is becoming more and more automated, and understanding that interplay of technology, human behavior, effective communication, all of that, it's more important now than ever.
It's like a cautionary tale, right? A reminder that progress without careful consideration can have unintended consequences.
Precisely. And, we can apply these lessons to so many areas of our lives, whether it's, a new piece of software we're using or navigating a potentially hazardous situation, taking that time to understand the risks, the instructions, and even our own reactions. It can make all the difference.
It's really about being mindful, being proactive, not just blindly trusting that technology will always have our backs.
Exactly. We have to be active participants in our own safety.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more aspect I want to explore. The report also delved into the public's perception of these automatic crossings.
Yes, the human element. How did people feel about these new systems compared to, the familiar old manned gates? Did they trust them? Did they feel safe? That's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
It is, and we'll dig into that in our final part. As we were prepping for this deep dive, I kept coming back to this one section of the report where they really delve into the psychological aspects of safety. It wasn't just about, the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of the crossing, but also about how people perceive risk how they react to new technology, especially when it comes to something as, life or death as a level crossing.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? They recognize that these modern automatic crossings with those half barriers might not have inspired the same sense of, well, security as those big old-fashioned, full gates that we often see in old movies and stuff.
Right, like those big heavy gates, those felt like a real barrier,
Yeah.
like a solid imposing wall between you and the train. There's a certain visual reassurance in that, You can see that nothing's getting through.
Absolutely. And the inquiry, they acknowledge that this perception of safety, or lack thereof, could actually influence how drivers behave at the crossing.
So if you're not quite sure if you trust the system, you might hesitate, you might panic, you might make a hasty decision.
Exactly. The report actually uses the word fear, talking about how fear and unfamiliarity with new technology could lead to, well, all sorts of dangerous behaviors. Stalling on the crossing, making impulsive moves, things that could put drivers in real danger.
So how do you address that? I mean, how do you make people feel safer when the very design of the crossing might be contributing to their unease?
Public education, that was a huge emphasis in the report. They stressed the need for really robust public awareness campaigns that went beyond just, explaining how the system worked, but also addressed those underlying anxieties and tried to build trust in this new technology.
So it's like saying, hey, we know this looks different, we know it's new, but trust us, this has been designed and tested, it's safe.
Exactly. Transparency, reassurance, those were key. They even suggested creating detailed pamphlets, that explain the logic behind these automatic crossings, highlighted their safety records, tried to debunk any misconceptions that people might have.
It's like they were trying to say, don't be afraid of progress.
Yeah, in a way. They wanted people to understand that different doesn't necessarily mean dangerous.
And it wasn't just pamphlets. They also recommended including information about automatic crossings in, get this, driving manuals and tests. So every new driver would be educated about how these things work.
Smart thinking, right. If you learn about something right from the start, it becomes less intimidating, more of a standard procedure.
Absolutely. And they also stressed the importance of consistency in everything, really. The messaging, the signage.
Oh, right. Yeah, like those emergency notices we talked about earlier, they said those had to go. They needed to be replaced with signage that was clear, easy to understand, and most importantly, consistent across all crossings.
No more of those, cryptic messages that almost felt like an afterthought.
Exactly. Big, bold instructions, impossible to miss, especially when it came to using that emergency telephone.
Because when you're in a stressful situation, clarity is key.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to be deciphering a confusing message when you've got a train bearing down on you.
Right. The goal was to eliminate any guesswork, reduce that cognitive load so drivers could just react instinctively and safely.
It's really impressive how much thought they put into not just the technical side of things, but also the human psychology involved. Like they were trying to nudge people towards safer behavior through thoughtful design and communication.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes this inquiry so valuable. They didn't just focus on the technical failures. They really tried to understand the whole picture, all the contributing factors, including how people were interacting with this new technology.
And in doing so, they produced this incredibly insightful report full of recommendations that, hopefully could help prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future.
It's a testament to the power of, learning from mistakes, right? Taking a tragedy and using it as an opportunity to improve the systems we rely on.
Well said. And it's a reminder that those lessons are just as relevant today, in a world where we're surrounded by increasingly complex and automated systems.
Absolutely. Whether we're talking about level crossings, self-driving cars, or any other technology that has the potential to impact safety, understanding those human factors is crucial.
Because at the end of the day, technology is only as good as the people using it, right?
Exactly. We have to be mindful, informed, engaged. We can't just passively trust that technology will always keep us safe.
That's a powerful message. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found our exploration of the Hixon Level Crossing inquiry as insightful as we did.
It's a story of tragedy, yes, but also a story of learning, adaptation, and ultimately a drive to create a safer world.
And we hope it inspires all of us to be more mindful, more aware, and more proactive when it comes to our own safety and the safety of those around us.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, stay curious, keep asking those tough questions, and as always, stay safe out there.
Thank you for listening to the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Remember, you can find more information on the website, inquestsandinquiries.com, or on the YouTube channel as well. link in the notes.